I was born on the coldest morning of the year in a neighborhood that never felt warm, even in summer. My birth certificate didn't just list my name. It carried an unspoken verdict, one scribbled in the margins of poverty, addiction, and abandonment. They said I'd be nothing before I ever spoke a word. I remember the peeling paint of our apartment walls, how the cracks spidered down like veins of despair. Our building always smelled of stale fried food and cigarette ash, the kind that clung to your clothes and followed you to school. I lived with my grandmother, Miss Odella, who was too tired to complain, but never too tired to love. She raised me after my mother overdosed on a kitchen floor still sticky with spilled syrup and cheap beer. My father, well, I wouldn't recognize his face even if he stood right in front of me. At school, the message was constant, even if no one said it aloud. I sat in the back row, where the heater never worked and the ceiling tiles above were water-stained and sagging. Teachers would look at me the way one looks at a dog lost on the highway, more pity than expectation. One of them, Mr. Danvers, once told me point blank, "Kids from your block don't go far, just be realistic." They thought they were preparing me for the world, but all they did was padlock the doors I hadn't even tried opening yet. At recess, I'd sit alone by the chain-link fence, tracing shapes into the dirt with a twig. I wasn't dumb. I just didn't speak much. I watched, I listened, I remembered. I kept a notebook hidden under my mattress, where I'd write down everything I saw and thought. Words were the only space I had where no one interrupted me, where I could build worlds no one could tear down. We didn't have much. On good weeks, we had electricity. On bad ones, I did my homework under streetlights. Miss Odella said I had God's fire in my mind. I didn't know if it was true, but I clung to her belief like a raft in a drowning sea. When I was 11, I scored highest in the school's standardized math test. I still remember Principal Johnson calling me into her office with a look that tried to be pleasant, but couldn't hide the disbelief. "Are you sure you didn't copy from someone?" she asked, as if it were impossible for someone like me to solve problems meant for someone like them. That night I cried. Not because I was sad, but because it finally hit me. I was going to have to fight twice as hard just to be seen as average. There were days I wanted to disappear, to melt into the background, and never feel the weight of being underestimated again. But then there were other days, brighter ones, where I'd stand at the window of our second-floor apartment, look up at the planes slicing through the sky, and whisper to the stars, "One day, you'll know my name." My grandmother kept a jar of coins on top of the fridge, mostly nickels and pennies. She called it the dream jar. Every time we had a few cents to spare, she'd say, "For when you get out of here, baby." She had arthritis so bad her hands bent like gnarled roots, but she still cleaned houses every other day, just so we could buy enough milk and instant noodles to stretch the week. On Sundays, we'd go to the library. It became my sanctuary. I read everything: biology, philosophy, robotics, ancient poetry. I didn't understand all of it, but it made my mind stretch. Books never judged me by my address or the holes in my shoes. They just welcomed me in. It was in that dusty library corner that I first read about a black female astronaut. Her name was Dr. Mee Jemison, a woman who defied every no thrown her way. I stared at her photo until my eyes blurred. That day, I tore a piece of notebook paper and wrote, "I want to be like her." But not just reach space. I want to change the world I land in. I folded that note into a tiny square and tucked it in my sock. I wore it for years. In middle school, we had a science fair. I built a small motor-powered water filter from old fan blades and soda bottles. I was the only student who brought something homemade. Everyone else's parents had helped them build polished displays with LED boards and printed infographics. Mine sat on a bent poster board with crooked handwriting. I won third place. They said it was surprisingly clever. But even then, it was never just praise. It was always surprise. As if my intellect was a fluke, an accident. I learned early. If you want to rise, make peace with being doubted. It will hurt, but the fire it lights might be the only warmth you'll have. By the time I turned 14, I had read more than most college freshmen. I started saving money from washing windows and bagging groceries to buy an old laptop from a pawn shop. It was slow, cracked at the corner, but to me, it was a portal to something more. I taught myself how to code from free online classes, staying up until my eyes burned and my fingers ached. Every night before sleep, I'd stare at the ceiling and say out loud to no one, "I am not what they said I'd be. I am more. I will be more." And in that vow, whispered in the dark, the seed of everything was planted. I kept that vow buried deep in my chest, like a coal that never cooled. It smoldered even on days when the world seemed determined to put it out. I fed it with every rejection, every insult, every pitying glance. People said rage could destroy you, but they never talked about how it could also carry you, if you knew how to steer it. By the time I turned 15, I had 3 part-time jobs: a morning shift at a corner bakery, an afternoon janitorial gig at the school, and evening hours restocking shelves at a rundown dollar store. I worked through my homework on break room counters, wiping away flour and dust just to have a clean space to solve calculus problems. My hands smelled of bleach and cinnamon, and my backpack always held a textbook, a banana, and a charging cable held together with duct tape. There were nights when my legs throbbed so badly I couldn't sleep. I'd soak my feet in a bucket of warm salt water, rubbing them gently while I read research papers I didn't fully understand but refused to give up on. My body was bone-tired, but my mind was ravenous. Despite the struggle, I kept applying. Dozens of scholarships, hundreds of emails, most went unanswered. Some came back with rejections so curt it felt like they hadn't even read my name. One organization, supposedly for underprivileged youth, told me my essay was too emotional and unrealistic. But then, one night, just as I was about to give up and delete all my drafts, a message popped into my inbox. It was from the Westhaven Institute for Young Innovators. They'd seen my submission, an AI model I'd written in Python to predict clean water access in urban slums. I had no lab, no funding, just data I scraped from public sources and a dream so loud it refused to be quiet. The email simply read, "Impressive, we'd like to interview you." I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just sat there, the screen lighting my face, feeling the edges of a future I had only dared to imagine brush against my skin for the first time. I told no one, not even Miss Odella. I needed to see if it was real. Hope was dangerous. Hope could destroy you worse than poverty ever could. The interview was via video call. I wore the only button-down shirt I had, a faded white one, too tight at the shoulders. The professor who interviewed me had a quiet, curious face and asked deep, specific questions. At the end, he leaned back, folded his hands, and said, "You're one of the most self-taught candidates we've ever met. You're raw, but you're brilliant." 2 weeks later, the acceptance letter arrived. Full ride, room and board, a stipend, MIT. I showed the letter to Miss Odella, and she didn't say a word. Just reached for her Bible, pressed the letter between its pages, and whispered, "God does answer from the dust." When I stepped onto that campus for the first time, it felt like walking onto another planet. Towering buildings of glass and stone. Students in branded hoodies discussing quantum theory like they were ordering lunch. I didn't speak for the first 2 days. I just watched, again, like I did behind the chain-link fence so many years ago. My roommate was a girl named Samantha, blonde, wealthy, with a father who was a senator and a mother who designed satellites. When I unpacked my things, just 2 worn suitcases and a duffel bag, she looked surprised. "Is that all you brought?" she asked, half laughing. I smiled, because I'd been preparing for that moment all my life. It's all I need. But fitting in was a battle I hadn't trained for. The lectures moved fast, assuming background knowledge I didn't have. Group projects were brutal. People rarely listened to my ideas, often steamrolling past them or assigning me the grunt work. One time, a guy named Lucas actually said, "Let's keep Amara on documentation, she's more practical." I knew what he meant. Not smart enough, not their kind. The loneliness was unlike anything I had ever known. I would lie awake in that tiny dorm bed, hearing laughter from the hallway, wondering if I was a fraud, an imposter in a borrowed dream. Maybe they were right. Maybe brilliance had a dress code I would never afford. But then I remembered the bucket of salt water, the streetlights, the library corner. I remembered the note in my sock, and I got up, and I worked. I stayed after class. I asked questions. I sent follow-up emails. I taught myself what I didn't know and then taught others who were too proud to admit they were also behind. Slowly, the professors began to notice. I got invited to research labs. I found mentors who didn't care where I came from, only where I was going. By my junior year, I had co-authored 2 academic papers on AI modeling for public health and was named one of the top 10 undergraduate researchers in the country. But the moment that cemented everything came during a tech conference where I was the only Black woman in the entire auditorium. My name was called for a panel of innovators of tomorrow. As I walked on stage, someone in the back whispered, loud enough to hear, "Is she lost?" I turned, looked directly into the crowd, and spoke. I was told I'd be nothing, that my place was in the margins, but I didn't stay there. I became the thing they never saw coming, and I'm just getting started. The applause that followed wasn't just for the research. It was for the journey, for every invisible mile I had walked just to be on that stage. And that coal in my chest, it wasn't smoldering anymore. It was burning like a sun. The day I walked into the applied AI lab at MIT as a paid researcher, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt terrified. The walls were made of glass and steel, and the people inside had names that echoed in scientific journals. They spoke in acronyms, coded in languages I was just beginning to master, and moved with a kind of careless confidence I had never known. But I had earned my seat, even if they didn't think I belonged. During my first week, I kept my head down. I listened more than I spoke, watched how the others handled failures and how often their failures were forgiven, chalked up to experimentation. For me, failure wasn't an option. If I tripped, I didn't fall behind, I disappeared. I remember one meeting in particular. The team was working on a neural network to optimize emergency medical responses in underserved areas. I had spent the previous night digging through public EMS data, manually labeling anomalies that the algorithm missed. It was tedious work, painstaking and thankless, but I brought it up in the meeting anyway. Before I could finish explaining, one of the senior researchers cut me off. "That's not how we approach modeling here," he said with a smile too wide to be kind. "Maybe stick to documentation." That word again, documentation, a box they loved to put me in, pretty, polite, quiet. It took every ounce of restraint not to storm out, but I didn't. I stayed, I listened, and I waited for my moment. Later that week, I stayed after hours, running the data my way. I found patterns their model had ignored, critical lags in response times correlated with low-income zip codes. I compiled my findings, annotated every chart, and sent the report to Dr. Harris, the lab's director. I didn't expect a reply, but the next morning, he called me into his office. "You found something our entire team missed," he said, tapping my report with a pen. "Why didn't you say anything sooner?" I smiled. I did. From that day on, my place in the lab shifted. I wasn't just the girl with the scholarship anymore. I was Amara, the one with the sharp eyes and sharper data. Still, outside that lab, the battle raged. Some professors praised my mind but constantly questioned my tone. "You're passionate, but be careful. You don't want to seem aggressive," one of them warned after I defended a thesis critique too forcefully. Meanwhile, Samantha, my roommate, could demand changes in group assignments and be called assertive. I called it what it was, coded bias. But I didn't waste time arguing anymore. I built. I worked. I filed the unfairness away like nails in a toolbox, something I'd use later to build something bigger than they could imagine. By senior year, I had launched my own project, an open-source AI toolkit to help public schools predict and prevent dropouts using local, community-based metrics. It combined predictive analytics, behavioral patterns, and real-time student feedback, all packed into a free platform that could run on old, underfunded systems. No one believed it would work. Too ambitious, they said, too risky. The same voices, always the same. But then the pilot launched in 3 inner-city schools across Boston. Within 3 months, dropout rates dropped by 23%. Student-teacher intervention increased by 40%. Kids who were falling through the cracks were finally being seen. The press caught on. Boston Herald, Wired, even NPR, they all wanted interviews. They called me a visionary, a young disruptor, even the future of education tech. The words felt surreal, as if they were talking about someone else. But I remembered every inch of the journey that had brought me here. The bleach burns on my hands, the sting of that streetlight, the whisper of "Is she lost?" So when MIT announced the winners of the National Collegiate Innovation Award, I wasn't surprised when my name was called. But I was overwhelmed when I saw the crowd rise to their feet. I stepped onto that stage in a plain black suit I had borrowed from a friend, clutching the trophy that weighed less than the expectations I'd carried all my life. My speech was short, honest. When I was 10, a teacher told me I'd never make it past high school. When I was 13, a woman at a bus stop asked me if I was in a gang. When I was 15, I was told I was dreaming too big. So I learned to dream with my hands. I learned to dream with code and math and maps and grit. And I'm not done dreaming yet. The crowd erupted. But the real victory came later, in a quiet corner of campus, where I found an email waiting for me. It was from a girl I didn't know, from a school I had never heard of. The subject line read, "You made me believe I could, too." I opened it. She wrote about how she'd been ready to drop out, how she'd seen me on a news segment, how she started coding at her local library, how she believed, maybe for the first time, that someone like her could become someone. And that's when I understood. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about every kid who had been told to sit down, be quiet, and aim low. Every girl with brown skin and broken shoes and a mind full of fire. This was about being the mirror I never had. And as I closed that laptop and looked out at the city skyline from my dorm window, I whispered a new promise. I broke in. Now I'm holding the door open. Success doesn't arrive with confetti. It slips in quietly, almost suspiciously, like it's afraid you'll scare it off if you look too directly. The first time someone called me Dr. Amara Lewis was during a panel in New York, a year after I graduated. I had just launched my second startup, a data science platform designed to help community clinics allocate medical resources in real time. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't flashy, but it was saving lives in places no one else bothered to look. After the event, a white-haired woman approached me, clutching a faded newspaper article about me from a year ago. Her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. "My granddaughter saw your story. She stopped skipping school. She says she wants to be just like you." I nodded and thanked her, but I felt something rupture quietly inside me. It was the realization that my fight had started as personal survival, but it had grown into something much larger. I wasn't just defying the odds anymore. I was rewriting them. Over the next few years, my calendar became a blur of flights, keynote speeches, grant negotiations, and boardroom presentations. I'd step off a red-eye in London, pitch an education reform model in Geneva, then be back in Oakland the next night to mentor girls at my old neighborhood's new STEM center, the one I built and named after Miss Odella. I kept a photo of her on the center's main wall, her eyes warm, her smile tired but proud. Below the frame was a quote in big black letters, "God does answer from the dust." The world finally saw me. The girl who was supposed to be nothing was now on magazine covers, podcast intros, and think tank invites. They called me the mind from the margins, the hope engineer, the girl who coded her way out. Everyone had a title for me now. And yet the more praise I received, the more often I thought of those early days, of how silence and shame were once my closest companions. Because no matter how many stages I stood on, the echoes of "she's not good enough" still lingered like ghosts. It wasn't insecurity. It was memory, and memory is stubborn. Then came the call that would change everything. The director of the International Health Alliance reached out about partnering on a continent-wide health distribution system using predictive AI. They had funding. They had political will, but they needed vision. My name, he said, came up in every room. The scope was massive. It would take years. It would require a headquarters, a full research institute. I said yes without hesitation and decided it was time to come home. I returned to Chicago not with nostalgia, but with purpose. I bought the very building where my grandmother used to scrub floors. I turned it into the Odella Institute for Applied Humanity, a hybrid campus for tech research, youth incubation, and public data ethics. We didn't just teach kids how to build systems. We taught them why justice must be coded into every algorithm. Some said it was idealistic. I said it was overdue. One afternoon, as I walked down the hall of the institute, a young girl with dark skin and tightly braided hair stopped me. She looked about 9, clutching a worn tablet with my TED Talk paused on the screen. "Is it true," she asked, "that they all thought you couldn't do it?" I knelt to her level, smiled, and answered honestly, "Yes, every one of them." She looked down, then said, "They say that about me too." I took the tablet from her hand, rewound the video, and pointed to the screen. "Then maybe one day, someone will pause your speech and ask you the same thing." That night, I sat alone in my office, staring out the window toward the streetlight that once lit my textbooks. I thought about the people who had watched me struggle and said nothing, the ones who whispered doubt, who tried to box me in. And I realized they were my unintentional architects. They built the resistance I trained against. They gave my rage direction. They carved out the outline of the woman I was meant to become. It wasn't forgiveness I felt, it was clarity. The world now saw me as a success, but only I knew the full cost, and I would spend the rest of my life making sure no other child had to pay it. That's when I made the decision that would shape my legacy. I created a new fund, the Scene Project. Its mission, to find children society had deemed invisible and make them visible through education, mentorship, and digital access. No more dusty chalkboards, no more locked library doors. We'd bring the future into every forgotten classroom. I didn't need to be everything anymore. Now, I needed to build a world where no child was told they were nothing ever again. There's a quiet kind of power in living a life no one thought you could. Not the loud success with champagne toasts and flashing cameras, though I had those moments too, but the quieter ones, walking into a boardroom where everyone once doubted your presence and sitting at the head of the table. Signing paychecks for people who once told you to aim lower. Walking through your old neighborhood and seeing a child look at you, not with pity, but with possibility. I was no longer just the girl who escaped poverty. I was the woman who dismantled the cage. By age 32, I had founded 2 companies, established an international nonprofit, and built the Odella Institute into a global model. I was on advisory boards for education and health equity in 7 countries. When world leaders gathered to discuss innovation, my name was on the guest list, not as a courtesy, but as a necessity. And yet, amid the accolades and influence, what I valued most were the letters. Every week, dozens arrived, from girls in Detroit, Accra, Mumbai, and Manila. They were handwritten and imperfect, ink smeared by emotion. Some came with drawings. Others came with nothing but words that cut straight to the heart. "You made me believe I could learn." They told me I was too dumb to dream. I'm dreaming anyway. I didn't think anyone like me was allowed to exist. Then I found you. I kept them all in a wooden box on my desk. Whenever doubt crept back in, and it always did, I would open that box and remember that my life was now a lighthouse for the ones still sailing stormy waters. But not everyone celebrated the light. There were critics, always. Some whispered I was too political. Others called me too emotional for tech. A few said I had abandoned meritocracy by prioritizing disadvantaged communities. Some said I was playing savior. They didn't understand. I wasn't saving anyone. I was returning. I was reclaiming what should have never been withheld. Dignity, access, belief. Then came the invitation that shook me to the core. A private university in New England, the same one whose scholarship committee once rejected me as unremarkable, invited me to deliver their commencement address. They sent a glossy brochure, a long letter full of praise, and offered to fly me in first class with a speaking fee large enough to fund 10 scholarships. I said yes, but I flew economy. On stage, I wore a simple navy suit and carried nothing but a folded sheet of paper in my hand. I looked out at the sea of fresh graduates, bright-eyed and hopeful. Many of them had never known hunger. Many would never have to choose between books and dinner. But a few in that crowd, just a few, had walked through fire like I had. I spoke to them. I was told I wouldn't make it, that I didn't belong, that my dreams were too big for the box they placed me in. But I outgrew their box, I burned it, and I built something bigger. And now I hand you the matches. When I walked off stage, 2 women waited backstage, professors. One of them looked at me and said, almost ashamed, "You interviewed here when you were 17. I was on the panel, I remember." I nodded, I remember too. She opened her mouth to say more, but I didn't need her apology. I had already turned that moment of rejection into a stepping stone. Her memory of who I was would never match the truth of who I became. That night, I returned to my hotel, turned on the news, and watched a segment about a girl in Rwanda using our AI tools to map disease outbreaks in her village. She couldn't have been older than 16. She had braided hair, a determined expression, and eyes full of something I knew intimately: fire. I smiled and whispered to the screen, "You'll be everything, too." Then came the news I didn't expect. Miss Odella's house, the one still standing in the south side of Chicago, the one I'd left untouched as a memory, had caught fire during a storm. It was beyond saving. I flew home the next morning. The fire had consumed everything. The kitchen table where I'd done homework, the window I used to watch the stars through, the worn rug where she sat to pray. I stood there in the ash, eyes burning, not just from the smoke. Sometimes, the past is reduced to ruins not by violence, but by time. And yet, as I sifted through the blackened debris, I found something. Inside a charred metal box, beneath melted plastic and soaked paper, there was the dream jar, still intact. Covered in soot, its lid rusted, but whole. Inside were a few coins, a folded note, and a photo of me, aged 10, standing on the porch with a backpack too big for my frame and a look too serious for my age. I held the jar to my chest and sobbed. Not for what was lost, but for what was kept. For the proof that even then, when the world saw nothing, she saw everything. There is a strange silence that follows the collapse of something sacred. The days after the fire felt hollow. The streets of my old neighborhood were still familiar, the same cracked sidewalks, the same corner store with the fading mural, but something essential had vanished, like the last whisper of a hymn you grew up hearing but can never hum again. I could have rebuilt the house. I had the money, the architects, the permits, but some places aren't meant to rise again. Some ruins must remain, not out of grief, but out of reverence. That plot of scorched earth became my memorial, not to Miss Odella, but to the little girl she raised, the one who dared to believe that dreams were allowed to bloom even in concrete. Instead of rebuilding, I planted a garden, just sunflowers, her favorite, and in the center a brass plaque that read, "To the ones they called invisible, you were always seen." That spring, I returned to the Odella Institute with a new purpose. We launched an initiative I had been dreaming about for years, Project Before the World Noticed. Its mission was simple: to find young people long before society decided who they were, before test scores, before criminal records, before broken homes and broken systems could stamp them with their place. We found them everywhere, hiding in foster care, whispering in libraries, skateboarding in alleyways with nothing but headphones and too many unshed tears. And when we gave them laptops, mentors, and a seat at the table, they didn't just learn, they soared. One girl built a wildfire detection tool using recycled phone parts. A boy in Texas taught himself 5 languages to create a translation app for immigrants with undocumented status. Another rewrote an entire school district's attendance tracking system at the age of 14. They were never nothing. They were always everything, just waiting for someone to look. That year, Time named me one of the 100 most influential people. They used a photo of me standing barefoot in the sunflower garden. I wore no makeup, no corporate blazer, just jeans and a t-shirt that read, "They were wrong about me." But the greatest honor came months later, at a modest ceremony hosted by the United Nations. They had created a new award, the Odella Human Dignity Prize. It would be given annually to someone who uplifted marginalized youth through innovation and care. As I took the stage to accept it, I looked out into the crowd and saw a young woman I had once mentored. She had aged out of the foster system, dropped out of school, and almost disappeared into the cracks until we found her. Now she was working with UNICEF, designing systems for global education reform. Our eyes met. She nodded. I didn't prepare a speech. I spoke from the place where my silence used to live. "I'm not here because I was exceptional," I said softly. "I'm here because someone loved me enough to see past the rubble, because someone believed before the evidence arrived. My grandmother didn't have wealth or power or access, but she had vision. And with it, she raised a girl who turned invisibility into light." The room stood. But I wasn't crying for the applause. I was crying for the girl I used to be, the one sitting under the flickering streetlight, knees scraped, eyes wide, writing code in a broken notebook, because it was the only thing in the world that made her feel real. Years later, when I published my memoir, I didn't call it Success Against the Odds. I called it The Girl They Didn't See. It opened with a letter. "To the child reading this in a corner, thinking no one sees you. I do. And I promise, you are not what they called you. You are not your zip code. You are not the absence of a father. You are not a test score, or a mistake, or an afterthought. You are a seed. And you are meant to grow where they said nothing could." The book hit #1. But more important, it was found in classrooms, in shelters, in youth prisons. That was the real bestseller list, the hands that needed it most. In the final years of my 40s, I stepped back. I gave leadership to younger voices, the ones with new fire. I traveled. I sat with elders. I listened to villages and city blocks alike. And I visited that sunflower garden once a month, quietly, alone. One day, a little girl was there with her father. She pointed to the plaque and asked him what it meant. He struggled to explain. So I walked over, knelt beside her, and said, "It means someone who didn't matter once made it matter for everyone else." She looked at me unsure. "Were you her?" "No," I said with a smile. "I was the one she believed in." And when I stood up and walked away, I knew something deeply and finally true. I had become everything they said I wouldn't. But more than that, I had made it so others didn't have to fight the same war just to be seen.